Hey vinyl community and Beach Boy fans. It's been a while since I've done any Beach Boy related videos, and so I figure that I am overdue. And so I want to talk a little bit today about Brian Wilson's debut solo album. This was released in 1988 on Sire Records. This is the vinyl copy, obviously, and the inner sleeve has the lyrics, and it has some credits and just one photo of Brian. It's on the Sire record label, which the Pretenders and the Smiths and Depeche Mode were also on Sire record label. This is the cassette version. And as far as credits go, you've got this, and then there's also more credits on the back, although no lyrics, unfortunately. And I've also got a CD version, which this was released on Rhino Records. So Brian Wilson's debut solo album was the first written and produced by Brian since the Beach Boys' Love You in 1977. During the 1980s, Brian was under high-profile around-the-clock care by Eugene Landy, his therapist, who had been hired in the 1970s to help Brian recover from his various addictions and return as a functioning member of the Beach Boys. Now, there had been the whole Brian is Back campaign surrounding the 15 Big Ones release in 1976, and Love You album, which was self-produced and was really considered a return to form for Brian. But after that point, Brian really had no substantial activity in terms of songwriting or producing any of the Beach Boys material. And so it really was something of a shock when in 1988 we heard that there was going to be a new Brian Wilson solo album. Back in 1983, Brian had started making sporadic trips to recording studios and had begun collaborating on songwriting with not only Eugene Landy, but his childhood friend Gary Usher, who had also co-written some of the early Beach Boys tracks, mostly the car-themed Beach Boys tracks like Little Deuce Coupe, Our Car Club. He was pretty much responsible for all those car-themed tracks that were on those early Beach Boys albums. So Brian was signed to Sire Records in 1988, and that was after label head Seymour Stein had heard Brian do an a cappella version of On Broadway at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction for Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller, who were songwriters from the 1960s. Stein appointed Andy Paley as producer. Andy Paley had done some work with Madonna and Elton John, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Little Richard. There were tensions during the sessions because Eugene Landy, as anyone who is familiar with the history of Brian Wilson knows, Eugene Landy exerted a very undue amount of influence over Brian's life. He micromanaged every aspect of Brian's life, and that carried over into the recording studio. There are stories of how there would be a lyric that Gary Usher and the other producers were really in love with, or a particular arrangement that they were very much in love with, and Dr. Landy would tell Brian, actually, I've come up with a better lyric, or, hey, Brian, why don't we try this arrangement? And if Brian balked, Eugene Landy would threaten to take away some of Brian's incentives that he had worked into Brian's treatment plan, as it were, saying, well, I guess you're not going to have that milkshake, or I guess we're not going to get that hamburger later, or whatever the enticement might be. And so there was a lot of corrupting influence from Dr. Landy during those recording sessions. And that's one of the unfortunate parts of this album, is it's hard to separate what is truly Brian Wilson and Brian's vision, and what is Dr. Landy's interfering influence? How did he corrupt the sessions? For me, this is a brilliant Brian Wilson album. I would like to believe that this, for the most part, is Brian Wilson. There's no mistaking Brian Wilson's melodies, the harmonies that he had come up with. Maybe the song arrangements are not exactly the way that the other co-producers had envisioned them. However, I think as a whole, this stands as a remarkable achievement in Brian Wilson's discography, because I don't think anybody really had much hope that Brian Wilson was going to pull it together again and be able to create an album as inventive and as effective and moving and powerful as the work that he recorded, not only during the Beach Boys time, but also just in the 1980s in general. I think it stands as a real testament to the fact that, Brian was in full recovery mode. He did have the enthusiasm, he did have the energy back to actually writing songs again and producing. And he wasn't in full recovery, and there were still things that he needed people to assist him with. But I think you really see that spark on this album of Brian Wilson's genius. I think there's so many great tracks on here. The biggest flaw in the album is the 80s production. And keep in mind, when this album was produced, it was in the late 80s, so it's very polished. There's an over-reliance on processed sounds and artificial, there's synthesizers and artificial drum machines. It's very much an album of its time. But if you can peel away all of the 80s production on it, there really are some fantastic tracks on here. I wouldn't mind even if Brian were to go back and maybe re-record or rearrange some of these songs, because they really are fantastic. You've got Love and Mercy, which starts off the album, which is Brian's philosophy, I guess you could say. Brian Wilson was a very caring, deeply spiritual individual, and that definitely comes through in that song. I was Walking the Line is a great track. Melt Away, again, it's the Brian Wilson melody, just the way Brian could craft one of those earworm melodies that would just stick with you. Granted, he had some help, and that's, again, like I say, don't know which arrangements were truly Brian Wilson's creativity and what was some interference or some participation of all these co-producers that you had. But I think even with all those cooks stirring the pot, there still are some really brilliant songs here. Melt Away is one of them. Baby Let Your Hair Grow Long is almost a counterpoint to Caroline No, but I think that's an effective track. Little Children is a charming track. He mentions his children's names, Wendy and Carney, but it's just a fun, bouncy little track. I like One for the Boys is another where it's just Brian harmonizing with himself and just showing how Again, he is reaching back to the influence of the Four Freshmen, those classic harmony arrangements that Brian had crafted in the 60s. There's so many. He's got such a great hook on it. I love the verses, how at the end there's Brian's got that ascending vocal harmony line right into the chorus. Side 2, Nighttime, is a fun track. I think they're all decent. And these are all songs, at least to my ears, that are memorable. I heard these once and they immediately stick with you. It's not an album that you listen to and then forget about. I really enjoy a lot of the tracks on this album. And not everybody feels the same way, but for me, there's enough of Brian's genius that shines through on this album. The big track on this album, I think the most impressive one, and I think the one that truly showed, Brian is actually back and writing, not to the achievements of a Pet Sounds or a Smile, but Rio Grande is just one of those, suites that Brian used to craft back in the mid-60s. It's got different sections. They're all melodic. We got some great harmonies. Some of it harkens back to Smile and the Elements. I've heard other people say, well, it's a carbon copy of him trying to recreate the stuff that he did for Smile, but I don't care. I enjoy it. I think it's great. And on the whole, I love this album a lot. I really do. I like Brian Wilson's other solo work, but this was just so refreshing. Not only did Brian Wilson look great, but he sounded great. He seemed to be starting to get the control back, his enthusiasm back. The fact that he came out with a solo album that sounded this good was so reassuring. It was so exciting to hear, and it really gave you confidence again that, Brian truly is not just going to fade away into the sunset, and we're going to get more great music from Brian Wilson, which we did. So anyway, that's my review, just kind of an overview of the Brian Wilson album. Always love hearing what you think about it. Where do you rank it among his catalog of music, not only with the Beach Boys, but also his solo stuff? And again, take care. Thanks for watching.